I'll get started. We're talking about the global upstream energy transition, which is a very, it's topical at the moment, no doubt. It affects all of us, whether you're working in oil and gas or not. And our speaker will be Dennis Stickley, who's an international legal expert in petroleum law. There goes my voice just as I start, excuse me. And my name's Anastassis Kokinos. I'm the director of Esanda. We're an upstream oil and gas training company, and we focus on upstream, but we do cover mid and downstream as well. But we're very mindful of the energy transition, and we do have a lot of experts that are familiar with what's going on and can support you if you have any requirements in that. You'll have to bear with me today because Ezra, my assistant, isn't available. So I'm doing the waiting room and managing the webinar. So we've got, post this webinar, we are running a seminar, and I'll just get Dennis to talk through the 10 reasons why you should join the seminar if you're interested in the energy transition and the carbon challenge. Dennis, you'd like to just give a quick talk on these points?
Yeah, by all means. Anastassis, are you able to bring them forward?
Can you see them?
I'm sorry, I'm not able to see them on my screen.
Oh, okay. Let me just check what's going on here. I'll stop share. Right, hopefully that brings it up.
Here we are.
Yep,
yeah,
sorry.
good. Well, I mean, this is, I guess, trying to convince you the relevance of this material in terms of how you do your job and how you can do your job better, and also you know, look out for the interests of the various stakeholders that you work with. And first and foremost, it's fairly clear now if y'all can mute your microphones.
It's our story, how I was too late. How you two tragically lost your minds at the sight of her mangled body.
What?
Yeah, Dennis, I've muted everyone. So I'll have to get you to unmute yourself. Dennis, I've muted you, so you'll have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
That's
yeah, sorry about that.
Right, no problem. Now, well, I started to say there are 10 very good reasons why the material that you're going to see in a condensed form is something you'd want to take in a larger seminar. First of all, how you deal, whatever your strategy is for decarbonization, is definitely going to be part now of licensing and contracting. Let me give you an example. Already yesterday, a federal court in the District of Columbia issued an injunction against any further federal oil and gas leasing because the effects of climate change had not been factored into the lease program. So, and here I'm speaking to you from Scotland. Here in the UK, there's a consultation process listing a number of test points that have to be considered in awarding licenses for further exploration activity, all centered around strategies for decarbonization. So, in other words, just coming in the door, just being able to to carry on exploration activity is going to be contingent on coming up with a carbon strategy, and that will flow through then to the approval of development plans and the conditions that'll be attached for decarbonization as part of the plan of development. Sales and purchase agreements. We're talking with people who are in the business of selling natural gas to state-owned monopolies in Asia, and they are being told that sales and purchase agreements are going to be subject to commitments for certification of net zero or carbon neutrality. We're seeing the same thing in LNG cargoes, where in order to access markets, you're going to have to come in on the basis of carbon neutrality. So it's impacting, as I say, market access. Because of the nature of the accounting processes, the inventorying processes for carbon emissions, it's incumbent on operators to be able to engage the services of consulting firms who will do the emissions modeling. This is all very based on estimates, based on formulas, conversion factors, a variety of calculations that have to be made. Obviously, you'll need to be working with people who understand and can apply that kind of estimating to the emissions coming from your portfolio. Again, with removal or offsetting of carbon emissions, this is going to have to be verified by third parties who are recognized and accredited to do this kind of activity on behalf of operators. You need to be able to determine which pathway is appropriate for decarbonization. Is it going to be application of technology to remove carbon emissions, or is another strategy is to get involved in some form of carbon trading system and look to a market mechanism as the means for decarbonization? Part of the process is to understand which carbon tracking systems are going to operate under the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, again, about 2 months back, Scotland hosted the COP26 climate summit. There were some significant actions taken there, largely around completing what's called the Paris Rulebook, which sets the stage for emission trading. Also, the commitments that have been made on methane reduction, and also the commitments the countries have made themselves on their national determined contributions. So just understanding how the framework is set up is important here. Also, we're looking at the decisions that have to be made to either invest or divest of operating properties and discoveries based on the limitations of carbon budgets that are going to be placed on those properties. This is the so-called stranded asset evaluation that companies will be going through. Shareholders, whether they're investors, whether they're insurers, whether they're lenders, these stakeholders all have a direct interest now in carbon management, what's being done, and in order basically to continue to participate in various markets, whether it's a financial market, whether it's insurance market, whether it's a stock market. It's going to be necessary to be able to demonstrate that you have a decarbonization strategy. And then finally, you want to be able to avoid being the target of activist litigation. For those of you who are in the Americas, you may know that ExxonMobil has been sued in Guyana over their treatment of carbon emissions, and I think we've tracked in the Energy Law Academy, we've tracked nearly 2,000 pieces of litigation which have involved issues about carbon emissions. So I think that's it in a quick bullet point kind of approach. So those are the reasons that we hope you will be joining us on the 2nd and 3rd of March for the expanded seminar.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. As well as the upcoming seminar, we've got a range of webinars coming up as well, which have all been, so far we've run 3 webinars and they've been heavily subscribed, which is great. Makes us feel like we're doing something right. The topics are interesting for a lot of people, which is good. So yeah, we've got another one in February, March, right through to November. And we do have one scheduled for December, but that's yet to be posted. And at the end of the talk, I'll be talking to you about how we're going to send you the links for this seminar, the webinars, and also how you can arrange a meeting with myself to discuss any of these items and your learning and development needs. This is the sales spiel. So if you want to talk to me about any of your training programs or how we can support your learning, you can click on the bit.ly link, which is to book a meeting with me, or take a photo of or use the QR code to do that. And I'll send that in the chat as well. So you're welcome to join or make a booking while the seminar is going. And finally, before we get into it, I've muted all the attendees. Should have been done automatically, but as I said, Ezra's not here to help today, and she's the wizard at this. Questions, we'll just be using the chat function during the webinar, and we'll answer as many of these during and at the end, and possibly we'll have some open mic Q&A if it works. And if we don't address all the questions live, we'll follow up with email, and you're welcome to send email questions post the event, or if you see the recording and something comes to mind, we can follow up with that. As I said, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel with all the other webinars that we've done so far. And any other questions, feel free to contact us at training@esandaengineering.com, or use the booking links that I've just provided to arrange a meeting with myself. Okay, so I'll hand back to Dennis and let him get on with the webinar. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah.
You got the screen?
Yeah. You're superimposed over the.
Yeah. Okay. So you'll just have to share your screen. Click on share screen and take that.
Yeah. No. I'm sure it's there. Let's just try it again. Okay.
Yeah, right. Great. All right, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, we're going to look at this topic in 3 parts. What I call the focus, which is, let's look at why this is such an important topic. Why we're spending time today sort of laying the foundation. In the second part, I want you to take you through the various drivers, what's propelling the decarbonization of the upstream sector, and then finally to talk about some of the gaps that are still there that, where we need to have specific answers, whether they're about technology, whether they're about rules. In the focus, these are the topics, the terminology, what are greenhouse gases, what is this thing called carbon intensity, because that's the primary metric, that's what we're measuring, that's what we're dealing with. Where are the carbon emissions coming from in the upstream sector, and how does this all sort of lay up against levels of production that are being forecast? Well, basic terminology, net zero emissions. This is achieved when the greenhouse gas emissions are balanced out by carbon removal. Okay, so this is one for one kind of process, and there is another approach called carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality is looking at how we reduce emissions by using something called offsets. Okay, so here, rather than removing CO2, we're looking at activities like reforestation, where we're balancing out emissions by systems that allow carbon to be reduced. Now, the difference between net zero emissions and carbon neutrality is primarily when do you turn to some sort of market-based or accounting kind of system as the process for leveling emissions. And in the case of net zero emissions, that is a last resort, whereas carbon neutrality, we actually begin with some kind of accounting process. Prior to either net zero emissions or carbon neutrality, there's also another way station on this pathway, which is called a low carbon economy. And here, what's happening is we're decarbonization until we actually can reach a net zero economy. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. Take production platforms. Many production platforms operate pumps, compressors using hydrocarbons. So the one approach for low carbon production would be to electrify those pieces of equipment. Okay, that doesn't eliminate emissions, but it does reduce them. So it's a step on towards low carbon operation while you're still working on a broader, longer term strategy for either neutrality or net zero. Well, you've heard the term greenhouse gases, and let's talk about what this group of gases look like. And so they are water vapor, nitrous oxide, ozone, and particularly now we're talking about carbon dioxide and methane. I should say a little bit about ozone because it was fairly topical maybe 10 years ago. And fortunately, the issues around ozone have largely been dealt with, because the concern was that a class of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons were potentially going to create a gap in the ozone layer. So we did learn quite a bit about managing greenhouse gases going through the Kyoto Protocol around chlorofluorocarbons, and we're bringing that forward, that experience forward in terms of now dealing with the carbon compounds. Well, molecularly, this is what we're looking at in terms of the different makeup of carbon dioxide and methane, and particularly methane is getting singled out primarily because it has a higher carbon intensity than carbon dioxide itself. So when we talk about the carbon, we measure them in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Now this is a way of looking at what is the global warming potential of different kinds of emissions. And the standard unit of measurement is a metric ton. Now, a lot of what we're talking about in decarbonization is it's a combination, I guess, of three things. First of all, we're looking at how do we go about accounting for the level of emissions that come from operations. So that means that we have to have some system for gathering that data, some system for organizing it. And so here I've listed for you the basically three main systems that are used for this accounting activity, whether it's ISO 1400 or the so-called greenhouse gas protocol, or if you operate in North America, you've got 40 CFR Part 98, Subpart W, which deals with the measurement and reporting of greenhouse gases. Okay, so that's the accounting activity. The second important activity in decarbonization are the rules. This is a rule-based system. As we go through this discussion, you'll notice that a lot of the framework for this has come out of what's called the Paris Agreement, which was an international convention that was adopted in 2016 and has been worked on and updated at a conference of the parties every year after that, of which we've just had the Glasgow Climate Pact adopted back in November. So yeah, so understanding that you're working within a system of rules. And the third area that's significant now is the kind of technology, both in terms of the way that the estimates are compiled, and in terms of the technology that's being applied for removal. Now, some of this is very large scale, like carbon sequestration, or the manufacture of so-called blue hydrogen using natural gas as a precursor for that. So we're bringing together this amalgamation of both accounting, of rules, and of technology to create this process of decarbonization. Well, let's set some kind of a baseline when we talk about the level of carbon emissions. It's approximately 50 billion tons a year are being emitted, and as the diagram shows you, about 73% of this is coming from energy use, and of that, the upstream oil and gas sector accounts to about 4 to 6%. So we're looking at something between 1.5 to 3 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide that's attributable to petroleum production. Now, not all areas, even though this is a global phenomenon, not all areas of the world are impacted by the same sources of emission. And this chart just gives you an idea, depending on where you're based, as to whether or not the source of emissions in the NP are coming from drilling and development activities, or whether they're coming from petroleum processing, particularly from natural gas processing, because again, we're looking at methane, which is, I think it's generally accepted that it's roughly 80 times more carbon intense than carbon dioxide, largely because it stays in the atmosphere for so long. Okay. The concern is that even though we recognize that decarbonization is essential as a way of combating global warming or climate change, that actually commitments to continue producing oil and gas are running above the level that we need in order to reduce those emissions. Okay, so the chart at the bottom basically is showing you the different scenarios that are possible in terms of reaching the goals that have been set under the Paris Agreement for achieving net zero emissions. Now, that translates in primarily into wanting to avoid an increase in climate warming of 1.5 degrees by the year 2030, or to a longer run objective is to limit climate warming by 2 degrees, by no more than 2 degrees by the year 2050. Okay. Now, however, the level of production is such that it would not track the rate of decline to reach either of those goals. And so what the International Energy Agency has said is that we need to see a decline of 4 to 6% from 2020 to 2030 to achieve the aspirational goal of climate warming of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Right. Well, what is the future of the different types of energy in order to meet this kind of goal? And this graph gives you represents the how the different layers of energy will have to be adjusted over time to reach the no more than 2 degrees by 2050. And as you can see, both oil, natural gas, and coal, the main hydrocarbon fuels, all decline and are largely replaced by renewables. Now, this is an interesting picture because a lot of operating companies are looking at this and making decisions that they want to go through what's called an energy transition. And part of that transition is actually moving from being a producer of oil and natural gas to a wider portfolio that involves production of renewable energy, development of hydrogen fuels, as well as continuing with the production of oil and gas. So you can see, even in this scenario, we continue to use and produce oil and gas. The question is going to be, whose oil and gas is this going to be? And the main message that I want to leave with you in this discussion is that when you look at who's going to be positioned to continue to produce oil and gas, it's going to be those companies, those operators that have adopted effective strategies for decarbonization. Now, okay, second part, what are the drivers? We've got sort of the big picture now. What's pushing this process of decarbonization? climate science, public opinion. We've actually, as a result of the Paris Agreement, we've got kind of a parallel process, both public and private, going on right now. This is all taking place within this international framework that I mentioned earlier. However, there are now national policies that are starting to come out and actually be implemented within individual countries. Let me give you an example. Talking to a client in Indonesia, and they've been, the government of Indonesia has before the COP26 adopted rules to set up a system of carbon trading. So the approach that is being advocated there is going to be one of, if you're going to produce oil and gas, you're going to have some form of offset to be able to do that. In Australia, I think the Prime Minister of Australia recently said they want to follow technology, not taxes. Okay, so there's going to be an emphasis in Oceania placed on carbon capture and storage. Right. Okay, so investment and finance. Now, you probably no stranger to the fact that the petroleum industry is the most capital intensive industry other than nuclear energy. So in order to attract investment and retain investment in the sector, lenders have formed a variety of alliances basically to require that borrowers make commitments to decarbonization. And then there's always the specter of litigation, and so that's another sort of driver that's out there. We'll have a little more to say about all of these. Okay, now climate science. Okay, there are three types of models that climate science are using. And so this is how do you predict, how do you forecast that global warming is real? And I should say that in 2021 the Nobel Prize on physics went to two gentlemen who pioneered the system of modeling climate change. So there's no issue now that the science is anything other than correct, and the main body for looking at the climate modeling that goes on is the World Climate Research Program at the World Meteorological Organization. Now, so public opinion. Well, what public opinion has been slow to recognize climate change as an issue, but here's an example of the recent public opinion surveys. Yale University found that 72% of those that were surveyed, this is in the US now, believe that global warming is real, that it's due to human activity, and that CO2 emissions should be regulated. Okay, so there's majority of support to move in this direction. In 2021, found that the majority of people again believe in climate change and that it is a global emergency. Pew Research did a survey of advanced economies, and this is what I think is the most important. 72% of the people believe that climate change would harm them personally. Okay, so this is sort of the where you have to make that crossover, is that it's not just recognizing that yes, it's a phenomenon, yeah, we ought to do something about it. But people now are starting to understand that individually they are being affected by climate change. So this puts the weight of public opinion behind decarbonization. Now right now we're in a parallel process, largely because under the UN framework for climate change, it's a voluntary process. Okay, so countries have to ratify the Paris Agreement. They are given much latitude to come up with their own differentiated approaches as to how they're going to deal with climate change in their own countries. But when you now take the next step down at the national level, we are seeing the greater movement towards legislation and regulation that both, well, I'd say voluntary means in terms of maybe you have to monitor, you have to report. Compulsory meaning you actually will need to take action. You'll have to implement a strategy for decarbonization. The other approach is more in-house. We're looking at how to basically develop a corporate strategy towards decarbonization. In other words, be proactive. And this is what I think is the realm that is, to me, the most interesting, because this brings in questions like, how to conduct a climate impact assessment, how to look at the measures that you're going to implement in order to mitigate or to adapt to the risk created by climate change. And again, you've got this sort of associate group, stakeholders, if you will, that are looking to the companies that they invest in, basically to be able, as part of management, to adopt a decarbonization strategy. International framework. Well, I don't want to sort of get too bogged down with this slide. Largely, what I want you to know is that the Paris Agreement is sort of front and center now in terms of the international framework that we're dealing with. The last piece of this puzzle was to adopt the Paris Rulebook. The countries have been discussing this for the last 6 years. Finally, they've come together now and adopted the Rulebook. And the main feature of the Paris Rulebook, quite frankly, is on how you go about setting up a system of trading offsets. Beyond the Paris Agreement itself, which is an international convention, you have other sort of initiatives, side deals that have been done around reducing gas flaring, decarbonization of oil sands in Canada. There's the Global Methane Pledge that was adopted for reducing emissions from methane by 30% by the year 2030. Considering that there's so much activity going on within individual countries, the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science has an excellent database if you want to look at what is the status of regulation, what is the status of commitments that have been made under the Paris Agreement. So this is an excellent place to visit for that kind of information. Well, again, the Paris Agreement, I've said a lot about that. Main thing I want you to understand now is that as of COP26, we now have 90% of all carbon emissions are within the umbrella of the Paris Agreement. Okay, so that means that 90% of the countries have committed to this target of net zero, meaning global warming of not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. In addition to that, countries are now in the process of developing and submitting their long-term low-emission development strategies. So again, this is this common but differentiated approach that's embodied in the Paris Agreement. And what I would say to you, wherever you're operating, is look at the commitments that have been made by the countries where you operate and see if the oil and gas sector is included in the national determined contributions and covered by these long-term low emission development strategies, because that basically tells you, where you'll be going. Okay, timeline here shows you that, our net zero goal is for limiting warming by 1.5 degrees. Now, this is referred to as an aspirational goal. Okay, so it's one that the signatories are striving for. They're committed to it, but hard and fast, the main metric is limiting warming to 2 degrees, achieving net zero by 2050. Within this international framework, there's sort of a secular process that's been adopted, which is called review, plan, and implement. And so this is showing you that we now have common timeframes in terms of planning. We have the national determined contributions. We're now starting to look at issues about climate adaptation. In other words, what can we do to adjust for the risks of climate change? I'll have more to say about that when we talk about litigation in a minute. And in implementation, okay, what are the strategies that are coming out? And then finally, review. So this is a cycle that is continually repeats, right? Well, I've already really talked a lot about the Glasgow Climate Pact. Again, one of the things I didn't talk about yet is this phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, this is very topical with energy prices set to rise. And what are governments going to do basically to see that the true cost, the full cost of energy is reflected to consumers. The Paris Rulebook, again, sort of the main point here is how to bring emission trading systems that have been operating in other countries. There are roughly about 6 different systems. How to fold them into this umbrella of the Paris Agreement, and that was achieved at this Glasgow summit. Now, I mentioned the subsidies. Well, this is a financial contribution by a government which is intended to provide some economic advantage. Takes many forms. They can be R&D, they can be development loans, loan guarantees, subsidized prices, and the beneficiaries are both consumers and producers. But there was a commitment made in the Glasgow Pact to phase them out. Okay, so again, you would have to look at where you operate and make a decision about whether you are operating under some system that gives you some kind of tax break, like the intangible drilling and development costs in the U.S., or are you operating under a system where, say, the government, subsidizes prices to end users, okay? Because again, the commitment is to phase those out. So if if part of your internal rate of return is dependent on these kinds of subsidies, they will be leaving. Well, more on just a little bit on subsidies in terms of this pressure has been on subsidies for some time. Didn't just sort of suddenly rear up in Glasgow. The IMF has been looking at this for some time, and as early as 2009, there was a commitment to rationalize and phase out inefficient fuel subsidies. So this again is one of the issues that's been around for a while. Finally, now folded in to as part of the process for decarbonization. Another term that has come out in the international framework is the reference to a just transition. Now, there are various examples. In the UK, there's the North Sea Transition Deal, the legislation recently passed in the US, American Rescue Plan. So there is a recognition that there are disruptions that will occur as we decarbonize the energy sector, and that there needs to be adjustments made. One of the main concerns that I have is this concept that's been embraced of some kind of equitable treatment based on the fact that you've got emerging countries that have had recent petroleum discoveries, countries like Guyana, and that they should be in a position primarily to be able to develop their natural resources as the larger recognized producing areas have been able to do. Side deals, well, the global methane pledge here, 130 countries have signed up to this pledge. Australia, China, India, Russia, South Africa have not made this commitment. But one feature that I think is significant is that Canada became a signatory to this global methane pledge. And what's interesting to me is that previously Canada said that they would be dealing with methane as part of their national policy, but didn't want to make a commitment in the Paris Agreement, and that since they've changed their position. There's the H2O initiative. Now this is primarily about the development of hydrogen as an alternative source of energy, and it is part of this low carbon economy that we talked about before, and also it is a form of technology for reducing, in other words, offsetting emissions from petroleum production. There's also a sort of a more extreme group that call themselves Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And these are countries that have decided that they will stop exploration and production for oil and gas. And so primarily France, Greenland, Ireland, Sweden, Wales, the Quebec province, all formed this alliance to say that they will no longer go forward with oil and gas exploration. Well, I talked about the common but differentiated approach under the Paris Agreement. This means there's a lot of flexibility to decide, what kind of policies are you going to adopt, or will you look at market forces primarily to restrain carbon emissions. Again, is the oil and gas sector included in the commitments made for national determined contributions? Can we look at carbon dioxide as a resource rather than as a pollutant? Okay, and I was intrigued to read that one of the large LNG terminals in the U.S. has been able, in terms of their operation and maintenance activities, to reduce methane emissions from their various trains enough that they have enough now additional methane to build another train. And so this is an example of where you can treat it as a resource, or you can look at it as some kind of a pollutant or waste. Will you adopt the strategy of carbon neutral or net zero? Carbon neutrality is, again, if you look at the LNG sector, there are companies that are making commitments now that the LNG they deliver into the market will be carbon neutral. First and foremost that comes to mind is Petronas. Petronas has made a commitment that cargoes they're delivering into East Asia will be LNG neutral. And of course, they're doing this mainly because they want to secure a position to access those markets, and that decarbonization is going to be one of the requirements to retain market access. See this in California too. The California Air Quality Board has adopted regulations that prohibit the refining and sale of petroleum that comes from sources that are considered to be carbon intensive. Like fuels that have a lot of sulfur compound, or that are highly viscous. Now, one of the concerns is maximum efficient recovery. Again, this is an area that's been litigated or is being litigated here in the UK. The trial judge has just thrown the case out, brought by environmental campaigners contesting that licenses should not be granted because they can't achieve maximum efficient recovery. Well, administration, who handles these kinds of issues within various countries? Well, the choice is, do they go to the environmental regulators, or do they go to the oil and gas authorities? Okay, and so you see, again, either approach is being adopted. Preferably, for decarbonization, we'd want to see that administration is given to oil and gas authority. Okay, yeah. Well, this slide gives you an example of the various executive orders and legislation that are being adopted by the US, the UK, and the EU. Implementation strategy. Okay, well, on an industry level, it's coming from various stakeholders, or in order to respond, say, to concerns of shareholders. Exxon's a good example of that with this group of investors called Engine Number One that were able to vote one of their representatives onto Exxon's board. Portfolio management. Okay, this is where you're making a considered decision based on economic criteria like internal rate of return, like payout, as to whether or not you're going to be able to produce the field that, as you make discoveries, and meet your hurdle rates of return. If you're not, then you're faced with the prospect of a stranded asset, in which case you may want to consider divestment of the of that particular asset. Also, we've got American Petroleum Institute, other trade groups that are looking at best practice and sort of a voluntary form of compliance. And then the concept of the circular carbon economy. This is what the Saudis are espousing, where you look at the reducing, reuse, recycle, and removal as the business model that you adopt. Well, we've got different approaches being taken by international oil companies. Primarily, the issue is whether to include what are called Scope 3 emissions. In other words, Scope 1 is direct emissions. Scope 2 are emissions that are not direct. In other words, what about the suppliers and transportation? Scope 3 emissions are those that have to do with the actual use and consumption of energy. Same thing with national oil companies. There's not a uniform approach. Again, there's notice some commitments to net zero, some commitments to carbon neutrality, depending on where you're at. Financial alliances, as I said, there's a strong coalition of lenders that are taking the position that they will only invest in companies that have made a commitment to net zero. Litigation, I mentioned the number of cases. There are about 2,000 cases now. And the big one right now is this decision that it's come from The Hague, which said that Royal Dutch Shell had to take Scope 3 emissions into consideration and reduce their emissions by 45%. What are the gaps? Well, the gaps are really around emission accounting. Scope 1, the direct emissions, you can see this chart lays out what percentage of emissions from production. Scope 2 is a slightly broader approach, brings in emissions from processing and transportation. And then Scope 3 brings in emissions from the actual consumption. So this is the inventory activity we talked about, whatever the carbon footprint is. And part of this process now is that you are able to verify the level of emissions, and also then to verify that you are either removing CO2 or offsetting CO2. And so you need to bring in third parties that are recognized for doing this. And there's the logos on the slide for some of the more high-profile groups that do this. Okay, carbon reduction. What strategy? Well, this is primarily a technology-driven strategy. Okay, or we could have maybe a strategy that responds to taxes, or we could have a strategy that looks at cap and trade systems for offset operations and maintenance. Again, this is an area where is particularly important for methane and also for flaring activities that have gone on. We mentioned already, the sort of larger scale kind of technologies, carbon capture, hydrogen. Still looking at whether demonstration projects have been scaled up in both areas. And there have been a number of commercial failures, so whether large scale technologies are going to be viable. Again, every day there's something new that's coming on that. Well, hydrogen and ammonia, again, this is the so-called blue hydrogen, where you're looking at process of electrolysis to break down hydrocarbon molecules. Carbon trading, again, this is a system where you create credits through various environmentally friendly techniques, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's a process for reforestation, and then those credits are certified and they can be traded as a way of offsetting carbon emissions. Diversification, we mentioned the shift from being a petroleum company to being an energy company, and from holding assets to divesting assets. Now there is a knowledge gap that's out there in terms of engineering, in terms of regulation, in terms of legal and finance. So I don't want you to think that the full story actually has been written. It hasn't. We're very much in the process of settling on standards for emission inventories. We're very much in the process of determining what the measures will be for regulating carbon emissions, and we're very much in the middle of looking at whether we can scale up some of these technologies. So this means that we come back to this cyclical approach where we look at plan, implement, and review process, and we are now looking at issues like completing the planning and developing a strategy. This is where we're focused in our discussion today. Being able then to implement that strategy and go through the process of monitoring and reporting to know, is this strategy being effective? Okay. Well, what's hangs in the balance? Okay. Well, being able to actually engage in exploration, as I said, being able to hold a lease, being able to hold a license or negotiate a production sharing contract, being able to secure financing, being underwriting for insurance, and being able to obtain market access, where markets are going to be increasingly adopting low carbon fuel specifications, and also public acceptability. I think it's important, though, as we leave this discussion to remember it's a lengthy and complex process, and that there is a net and net zero, which doesn't mean we're going to eliminate emissions entirely. It doesn't mean we're going to eliminate oil and gas production or use entirely, but we are going to do it in a different way, and we are going to have a different set of rules to play by. Well, the online seminar, 2-day program that's coming up, things we're really going to be focusing on, first of all, is about emission measuring and estimating emissions under the global greenhouse gas protocol and other tools. You know, if you're in with us from North America, you know, you've got the EPA's Code of Federal Regulations to deal with. We're going to be looking at what the API and other trade associations have done to help the industry deal with how to account for scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. What's coming up under the Paris Agreement? I said, you know, these parties meet annually. The next one is coming up this year in Egypt. And what about other initiatives? Primarily the Global Methane Pledge. Second day, we're going to look at more closely at nationally determined contributions. How are they developed? You know, what is the petroleum sector included? What are some of the decarbonization strategies? We've already talked about 3 approaches. We can look at technology. We can look at offsets. We can look at possibly carbon taxes. And how do you prepare a transition plan? Operating under new regulations and license conditions, and how to satisfy disclosure and transparency in the process of due diligence with investors, with stock exchange regulators. Right. Okay. Well, we sort of ran over just a bit here. It's a little more complicated than I thought it would be, but let's take questions. We've certainly got a bit of time for that.
Yeah, Dennis, we've got a couple of questions that came through, and the first one was carbon intensity is typically used as a ratio, kilogram CO2 equivalent over, you know, barrels of oil equivalent. What actually does carbon management entail versus carbon governance?
Right. Okay. Well, when we talk about carbon intensity, we're looking at whatever the source of carbon is in terms of the emission of metric tons, and this is referred to as CO2 equivalent. Okay. So this is a way of equalizing the level of emissions between CO2 and CH4, methane. Okay, so just as a way of scaling, and now how do you do this? Okay, you look at levels of production in terms of the barrel of oil equivalent, and a barrel of oil equivalent for natural gas is 80 times more carbon intensive than a barrel of crude in itself, because again, the impact that methane has as a greenhouse gas.
We did have an earlier question. Sorry, what are other renewables? I missed your slide on what you had there, but I put up the options of hydroelectric power, pumped hydro, and wave energy and geothermal energy. And I also commented on hydrogen, which isn't a renewable, but it has garnered a lot of interest lately, and it can be green hydrogen, or it can be black hydrogen, you know, if it's produced from methane or coal.
Yeah.
On this point as well, it's not just about renewables, it's also about us being efficient and energy conscious and conserving energy where we can. And thinking about when we drive down to the shops, whether we walk or drive, and just simple things like that will help in a big way if we all do it as individuals. And another thing that I think governments and communities need to be thinking about is, in Australia, where I am at the moment, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, we're all picking up individually, putting solar panels on our houses, and everyone's talking about batteries to try and optimize the cost that they're investing. But I think in some ways we're not looking at the economies of scale, where I think governments need to have battery banks like substations, as opposed to everybody having batteries on their roofs, in their houses to take the energy. Just to be more, rather than have hundreds of batteries, we have one battery bank. We need to be smarter and think about the way we do things and work as a collective. Sorry, that's just my 2 cents worth. A question further on was, if somebody corrected me, and hydrogen is not a source of energy. You do have to you burn energy, or burn fossil fuels to make it, or use renewable energy. And the next question was, does Glasgow Accord include a program or plan or funds commitments for how the oil and gas workforce will smoothly transition? Does it factor in worker age and stage of life, or use as a one-size-fits-all approach? So I don't know if you've got anything to comment on that, Dennis?
Yeah, well, I pointed out that this concept of just transition does address impact on workforce, and how that is handled is then going to be a question of national policy. So that's been looked at in the North Sea Transition Agreement here in the UK. It's been included in the legislation that's passed in the United States. So yeah, very, very definitely, the implementation aspect is left to the countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement. Now, having said that, there are working groups, and that's what this meeting in Egypt is going to be all about this year. There are working groups that will come together and start to articulate in more detail what countries can do in this regard. Now, I said I had a concern about just transition, and it's a little different than the question. My concern about just transition is that it's going to potentially open the door for countries that are being impacted by climate change to bring claims against countries that are major emitters. And there's a convention called the Warsaw Convention that already sets the stage for this to happen. And I expect to see more said about just transition, not so much in the way the question is presented, but more in terms of some recognition of what you might call climate justice for countries, say like Vanuatu or other island countries that are looking at possibly having to really make some serious adaptations to climate change. Any more questions?
We haven't got any coming through. I'll just give people a... Sorry, that shouldn't have gone through, that last one. Yeah, so are there any more questions? Because if not, I'll sorry. I'll be talking to you if you're interested in talking about having a meeting with me. I'll just put the slide back up. That's okay. So can you see that slide, Dennis?
Yes.
Right. So if anybody's interested in discussing the seminars, the webinars in further detail, they can book a meeting with myself. I'm happy to take bookings now or talk online to discuss any learning and development requirements you've got. And as mentioned, we'll be posting this to our YouTube channel probably within 24 hours. So you can access that, and we'll send you details of where to access the our YouTube channel. Okay. Right.
Okay.
So if anybody wants to talk directly with me, they can put their hand up on the chat, and I'll hang back until we've everybody's left.
And you do have my my email address on this on the first slide. If there's a question you want to send along, by all means do that. Happy to provide additional background materials if it's something that you're concerned about already.
Yeah. Well, you can email myself or Dennis, and we can Dennis can provide you with answers to any questions that might come up post the presentation. All right. So we've still got a lot of people logged in. I don't know if someone making a cup of tea or whatever, but I'm here to talk if you want.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. All right, Dennis. Thanks very much for the talk. It was great. And
My pleasure, Anastasis, and see you all in March.
yep, look forward to the seminar then. All right.